Hello, everyone, and welcome to JFK, the Enduring Secret interview series. From time to time, here at JFK, the Enduring Secret, we get a chance to interview important people in the JFK research community and others that are in some way connected to the story of the assassination. These interviews are often featured on our JFK, the Enduring Secret YouTube channel, as well as our regular audio podcast. If you found us by chance and you are not already a regular subscriber to the audio podcast, please do subscribe at your favorite podcast outlet. And please do the same over at YouTube on our YouTube channel of the same name, JFK, the Enduring Secret. Today we have the pleasure of presenting to you Larry Hancock and David Boylan. To anyone in the JFK research community, Larry Hancock is more than a recognizable name, and this is his third collaboration with David Boylan on a book. Larry is a prolific author and researcher, and David and Larry have co-authored another sensational book on the JFK assassination entitled The Oswald Puzzle, and they are here today to tell us about it. But first, let's say a few words about the background of our guests. Larry Hancock is a distinguished historian and researcher specializing in Cold War history and national security affairs. He earned his Bachelor of Arts with honors from the University of New Mexico, majoring in history, cultural anthropology, and education. Following his service in the United States Air Force, Hancock pursued a career in technical education, computer communications, and technology marketing. Upon retirement, he returned to his passion for historical research, focusing on military and intelligence aspects of the Cold War. Hancock is recognized as one of the leading investigative researchers in intelligence and national security, as well as a prominent historian in political assassinations. Known as a document geek, Larry researched and published several collections of CIA, FBI, and military documents prior to beginning his writing efforts. His document work led to his becoming a board member of the Mary Farrell Foundation, a major online history archive. With a dozen books in print, his works include an exploration of long-term patterns in covert action and deniable warfare. His notable works include Someone Would Have Talked, which presents a factual analysis of both the conspiracy and the cover-up surrounding President Kennedy's assassination. He's also written Shadow Warfare, The History of America's Undeclared Wars. That was a book co-authored with Stuart Wexler, which explores the evolution and the conduct of covert operations by the United States. Another important work was The Awful Grace of God, also co-authored with Stuart Wexler, which examines the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. Creating Chaos, Covert Political Warfare is yet another book which delves into the history and the tactics of covert political operations. And then there was Tipping Point, The Conspiracy That Murdered President John Kennedy, which offers an in-depth analysis of the conspiracy behind JFK's assassination. Larry's latest work, co-authored with David Boylan, is the subject of today's episode of JFK, the Enduring Secret, and it's entitled The Oswald Puzzle, Reconsidering Lee Harvey Oswald. It's scheduled for release on January 14th, 2025, and this book examines Lee Harvey Oswald's role in the Kennedy assassination, offering new insights into Oswald's character and his involvement. Hancock's meticulous research and analytical approach have made significant contributions to the understanding of complex historical events, particularly those involving covert operations and political assassinations. Now let's turn to the book's co-author, David Boylan. David Boylan is a researcher specializing in the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. A former IT professional at Brown University, Boylan has co-authored several works with Larry Hancock, including The Wheaton Lead, An Exploration, and The Redbird Airport Leads. He is also the author of the monograph, A League of Their Own, a look inside the Christian Defense League. All three of these are important readings for the interested audience. David himself has been interested in the JFK assassination since he was a kid. He kept up with a few developments when he was a teenager, and later in college when the HSCA announced that there was a conspiracy to assassinate JFK. He read a few books in the 80s and early 90s around the time of Oliver Stone's movie. But when he read Dick Russell's book, The Man Who Knew Too Much, that really got him going. He read it 2 or 3 times, often looking at the footnotes and slowly becoming aware of the radical right, folks like William Potter Gale, Edwin Walker, Dan Smoot, and others. And because he worked at a university that had just acquired a large collection of fringe material, the Hall Hogue collection, David took advantage of it. Thankfully, he did, and we have the fruits of his research today. Boylan frequently presents at the JFK Lancer conferences in Dallas and focuses his research on the JFK assassination. And now, without further ado, let's get right to the interview. I'm really pleased today to present to you two of the most well-respected JFK researchers and authors, Larry Hancock and David Boylan. And they are here to talk about, among other things, their new book, co-authored together, entitled The Oswald Puzzle. The book launches, I believe, on January 14th. Is that correct, gentlemen?
Correct.
And it's through Skyhorse Publishing, and you can order your advance copy now, as I did, on Amazon. All right. Well, welcome, gentlemen, and thanks for agreeing to be on the show. It's great to have you on.
Oh, happy to be here. Been looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too. It's good to see Larry again. Hey, Larry.
Yeah, I remember him.
Oh, yeah.
You know, our audience just heard your biographies before we got started here with the live show, so I won't duplicate that. But suffice it to say that if there was a Hall of Fame for JFK researchers, Larry, you would be in it. And David, your mutual choice to work together with Larry speaks volumes here for your reputation within the research and the writing community. So again, thanks to the both of you for being here. I first got to meet you, Larry, earlier this year. I reached out and you so graciously gave of your time to help me better understand some of the radical right matters that you had recounted in the Awful Grace of God. It was helpful in the development of my episodes on the radical right wing and back in the day. And David, I've not met you before, but I know, first of all, it's a treat to have you on and to get to meet you here in person today. Larry and David provided me with an advanced copy of this new book, The Oswald Puzzle, and I have read a good portion of it already. Not all of it, but enough already to say that it's fabulous. I'm constantly looking for the best writings on the assassination. They are essential to understanding and telling the story of the assassination. And as I tell it, as you know, on the JFK Enduring Secret podcast, it really has to be in a storytell form. And to that end, I am constantly asked by my listeners, which books would you recommend? And I can honestly say that every time I pick up a Larry Hancock book, not only do I learn something new, but I get a book that is completely readable, Larry, and understandable. And you've always maintained a style of writing that I've gravitated to, and I think it also underscores the clarity of your thinking. And that really shows up in your written works. Not everyone agrees with everything you say. Not everyone agrees with everything I say, but your clarity of thought is absolutely unmistakable. So with that, let's get started, gentlemen. I have an opening first question. And after reading a good portion of the book, this was the thing that was really sort of front and center for me. Uh, One of the curious things about the Warren Commission report is that with all the work that was done, they still couldn't ascribe a motive as to why Lee Harvey Oswald would kill President Kennedy. Now, that certainly implies a real puzzle to this young man. Tell us how that fits into the puzzle and the work that you've done in the book to address that.
Yeah, I think that's a very key element, and it reveals almost a fatal flaw with what the Warren Commission was trying to do. I mean, obviously, they had been assigned a task. We know that by now. The task that they've been assigned was just to follow up to what Hoover gave the Warren, he gave the Warren Commission a report, which actually they chose not to use. But, 48 hours into all of this, he gave his own people an assignment to write a report that says Lee Harvey Oswald did this by himself. So he wasn't even considering motive. I think it's fascinating. The FBI itself did not consider motive in their report, neither did the Warren Commission. So, that's usually fundamental. So one of the problems, though, that they both had, in particular the Warren Commission, and which I think this was a pivotal point for David and I, was when you start looking at the people that were interviewed, as far as Oswald's, his characters, personalities, beliefs, they found that he was very interested in racial justice and social justice and economic justice. They found that he had made positive comments about the Kennedy administration's stance on those things. So, here we have a fundamental problem in that here's a president who's doing a lot of things that Lee Harvey Oswald would support, especially with, economic. Oswald was very concerned about economics and poverty and those issues. So that's a problem for them. So what do they have to do with that? They even interviewed people who said he had spoken about JFK personally, positively. So that, like many of the things, what we find is it's interesting in that information is all in the appendices. like many things, they move it into the 26 volumes. They don't include it in their report. It's like, okay, we found things that we don't want to deal with.
Yeah, I like to refer to that in the podcast as it's right there lying on the rug. It didn't get put away, but it's not going to bite you, but it's right there on the rug. Uh, so yeah, I think you've answered my next question was, did you find any evidence that Oswald disliked Kennedy? I mean, that really is sort of central to the motive question.
Just the opposite, I would say. If anything, the only and it's interesting because we know from his own words when he was on the radio in New Orleans, he was asked a question that was a slanted question, essentially trying to get him to speak out against JFK in regard to Cuba. Like it's very personal. The president is, trying to undermine Cuba. What do you think about that? And Oswald turned that question around and literally said, it's not an issue with JFK. It's not the issue with the president. It's an administration policy issue. And I think that's kind of the way Oswald thought about matters. He didn't personalize them a lot. He had a very broad view of things. So no, I would say just the opposite.
The the subtitle of your book is Reconsidering Lee Harvey Oswald. Why did you pick that title? And what significance historically does it have?
That's a confession, actually. David will agree with that. That's a confession. As you know, Jeff, I've been writing about this since about 2000. And in my various books, I made statements about Oswald. I made assumptions about Oswald. And in some cases, I cited people, and I didn't do my homework. Later on, over the years, I found that I had kind of adopted, knowingly or unknowingly, what I finally came to believe was a rather superficial view of Oswald. And I wrote about him, and you and I have talked about this, like in bits and pieces. I wrote about Oswald in relation to this, in regard to that, whatever. And that's a bad approach to anybody as an individual. That's not the way you do biographies. You need a baseline. You need a full picture of the character profile. And so that's really my admission that I needed to back off. And of course, David and I did this, and Rex Bradford was a great assist in this as an editor for us. It needed to step back and say, okay, let's look at this man as a man. Let's look at him in terms of a biographical approach. What's the baseline for his character? And stop cherry picking, what you want to see for this slice of time. So
Yeah.
there's a confession right up front, transparency on my part.
Well, you've very often said that these circumstances are often very situational. He got himself. You actually just said that to me a few minutes ago. Oswald got himself in a lot of quite a varying set of situations, and so he was very situational in a lot of different ways, and that really does show up. It's interesting the comment about biographies. The work, for instance, done on people like Lyndon Johnson, which is a great example of a guy who could have such, on the one hand, such terrible traits in one sense, and yet also, go on to help push through some of the most important legislation ever passed in the history of the country. So there is. These are complex characters that we're talking about, and Oswald is no less so, even in his lesser role in this passion play. All right, so I'm going to go to some real zingers. Was Oswald a defector, as some JFK researchers think he was? Particularly highly respected people like John Newman and Jeff Morley. In other words, was Oswald perhaps a dangle in Russia to perhaps uncover a mole?
Well, I'll give three different answers. That's a big question, so it deserves
Yeah.
at least three answers. Let's answer the last part first, and David can speak to this. We feel that over time, over a period of, say, 4 years, Oswald became of operational interest to the CIA. And one area of that was mole hunting. Now, an important thing about that is none of that necessarily implies he was a witting tool or a witting asset. In fact, the last thing that you want in most cases is for your asset to be witting, unless he's an operational asset on a military mission or a spy. That's another story. But it's always better for deniability and for everything else for them to be doing what they want to be doing. And if you can use them under those circumstances, you're better off. So the mere fact that a 201 file was opened late on Oswald, even though the CIA was perfectly aware of what was going on in regard to he and Russia via the State Department, suggests to us that from a mole hunting perspective, yeah, he did become of interest to the CIA early on, in particular to Angleton's office. So first off, we've got to clear the decks and say, yeah, there was an interest deep within the CIA within counterintelligence. But as far as a spy, something like that, I'll say this: he doesn't fit the profile. After all of these years, we know we have very good view into something like Project Lincoln, which was really an intelligence collection operation by the CIA, where they got hundreds of people, they screened hundreds of people to pick the right few people to put into technical positions, to conferences and, scientific meetings. And they gave them very specific targets. They wanted information of certain type. Oswald doesn't fit any of that model. He just is not a good match for what we know they were doing. The other thing, and I'll let David speak to this, the other thing that we have learned that persuades us that he was not a witting, given orders type of guy was that in his entire history of his character development, we find no sign that Lee Harvey Oswald ever liked taking orders from anybody or anything. It does not matter whether it's high school or the Marines, whatever. David, you want to?
One of the things, we have to step back and look at is Oswald was 19 when he went to Russia, soon to be 20. that's a kid. I don't know what you were doing at 19 or 20, but I was not a spy. I doubt he was a spy or an asset. Um, so was he was very interested in socialism back then. And, he wanted to look at the Russian model and see what that was like. And he became disillusioned. So that's eventually why he came back. But as far as an asset, so Larry and I went down this rabbit hole as like a 201 file, PRQ1, PRQ. These are personal requisition questionnaires by the CIA, what they use to track somebody. So the four major pieces are 201 file, PRQ1, PRQ2, and a green list. If you're on the green list, that means you are operational and you're being used. That means you have a provisional operational approval at this time to actually go out and do something. We don't see any of that in Oswald's 201 file. So was it there? Did they pull it? We don't know. But no, a PRQ is just some basic information that they put in your 201 file. What's your name? How old are you? Where'd you live? Where are you now? PRQ2, I'm going probably down too far down this rabbit hole, but PRQ2 is a lot more information in that file that the CIA uses who you are. This is when they start collecting your contacts, people you've talked with, who are your relatives. And that is where they decide whether you became a witting or unwitting asset. So if Oswald had a PRQ2 file, they would say whether he was witting or unwitting in that file. And from that, they check off a green list saying, yes, this is who he is. And we put him before a lie detector and he passed. We don't see any of that as far as in his 201 file.
Now, you're not ruling out that those documents could have been destroyed, right? I mean, there is the possibility that they existed and then they weren't, ultimately available. I mean, and I'm not suggesting they were or they weren't. I'm just suggesting that you
Oh,
can't not
I mean,
rule that out, I think, right? I think that's
we don't know what we don't know. So
yeah.
yeah. Yeah,
Well,
and
another,
speculation, obviously, but that would, because no one can verify that. But that has been at least a practiced tactic at times within the CIA, I think.
right. Another thing where it generates a 201 file is if you have like 3 incidents where you come to the attention of the CIA. Whether you contacted somebody, you defected, you're in Helsinki on your way to Russia, that would be a 1. But once they hit 3 is usually when they create a 201 file on it, unless there's another reason for them to create one. So
Yeah,
there's
and the
that.
term, we're using labels, of course, but false defector is certainly in the category of witting. I mean, I think the idea there is that obviously there was a plan to send him there to actually effectuate what would otherwise look as someone who wants to go, but is not really going for the reasons that he's prescribing. And so you're suggesting that probably didn't happen. That really wasn't the set of circumstances as he was making his way into Russia and then back out. Is
yeah,
that
and I think one of the reasons we would assess it that way is we know what false defectors look like. I mean, we do have a record of some of these type of people, how they're recruited, what happens when they go to Russia. When they come back, how are they debriefed? I
Yeah.
mean, all of all of this when I started into this, all of that was still secret. We knew none of this when I was first writing in 2000. This has all come through releases more recently, that we know what this stuff really looks like and we can profile it and match it. So I, we know, for example, that those people that were sent over, not just as any type of intelligence collection asset, they actually prepared people to debrief them when they came back home, and they made records of those debriefs. Um, could they have done all of that with him? Possibly, but I think Jeff Morley has done an interesting thing. He's now got a collection of like 180 incidents of CIA, contact files of Oswald where there's mention of him and they know about him, but none of that includes this. See what? So they would have had to very selectively parse out just something like that. So why scrub part of it and not more of it? But it's as David said, we can't we can't say what we can't say what we can't say.
Right,
But
right. Yeah, for sure. So does that mean that you would probably agree with the Russians when because they obviously demurred their entire relationship with him. They said, "Ah, he's of no use." We assessed very early on that he was of no operational or intelligence value to us, and so therefore he was more of a nuisance than anything else. And
Yeah, that sounds right.
yeah,
at the end of the day, that you could see why they might lie about that if there was more to it. But at the end of the day, it sounds pretty consistent with what you believe to be true. At the end of the day, they were probably unlikely. I'm sure they check. I mean, there's certainly ample evidence that they followed him closely, more closely than we ever did when he was in Russia. But I think at the end of the day, their assumptions were that there wasn't really much there.
I think that would be our call, Jeff. And I think one of the early indicators is when Oswald, very early on, he gets together with an in-tourist guide and says, "Oh, by the way, I'm not just a tourist, I want to become a Russian citizen." And so he writes this note, like, okay, now this is not he just wants to become a Russian citizen. He hasn't renounced his US citizenship or anything like that. And their response is no. Here, and by the way, here's your ticket on the train back. When your visa is up, you're going, we paid you the train, leave, and they're fully prepared to send him back. He's not of any obvious value. He doesn't, so certainly their initial attempt turns into, and I think Ernst Titovets documents this very well from the Russian documents themselves. He was a political problem for them. And when he goes to the extent of, slitting his wrist slightly to be hospitalized, nothing fatal, but like, how are we going to handle this? All their other defectors, they gave PR opportunities. If you were a real defector, they put you on Pravda, you made speeches, you disdained the US, you spoke out against. Nothing like that ever happened with Oswald. Oswald Oswalds is a problem for the Russians, and they put him in a factory and put him in Minsk in Belarus, right? Okay, away from Moscow, away from any real visibility. So they didn't treat him that way. The other thing we have to be factual about is the U-2 thing. The Russians knew everything about the U-2 that they needed to know before Oswald ever showed up. And I'm afraid that has been a real diversion for us. And we don't know that through JFK research. We know that through military history research that is well documented, that the U-2, they knew exactly where it was flying, what it was doing, and how they needed to shoot it down. And ultimately they did. Had nothing to do with Oswald.
Along those same lines, many folks point to Oswald's proficiency in Russian at a very, very early age and a language that's really relatively difficult to learn. They point to that as a pretty good indicator that he didn't learn Russian on his own or in some Berlitz school somewhere, but rather maybe he went through an intensive learning program that was conducted by one of the intelligence agencies. How does that fit into the analysis?
Well, I'll take off on that and let David comment, but that's very confusing to me because the Oswald we see, irrespective of two Oswalds, the Oswald we see did not know Russian. As a matter of fact, Oswald did not actually start studying Russian until he got into Japan. And we have a very clear history from the Marines that he served with in Japan as to when he started carrying around a Russian simple language book, when he started talking about studying Russian. And he himself says the reason he did that was because of the interactions he'd had with the young socialist, Japanese communist, call them what you ever want, in Japan while he was there. And that really, he'd been interested in communism, socialism, Marxism, but that really got him turned on to Russia. And we know that, for example, we know that he took a military language test when he rotated back or when he was sent back to the US and performed very poorly on the spoken portion of the test, better, not good, but better on the written, which would again suggest that this is a person who's teaching himself Russian. Uh, it
Hey,
doesn't. We know from Ernst Titovets that when he got to Russia, Ernst himself said he could speak Russian well enough to talk to the tourist guide and maybe get around and see what was going on. But Ernst had to do a lot of tutoring with him. And Oswald's supervisor in Russia is on record saying he had to spend a lot of time teaching him enough Russian so he could work in a factory. So about all I can say is the historical record says, you know, either he's faking all of that from the very beginning or he really did teach himself Russian.
yeah, he used to carry around a Russian dictionary and look up words, Russian English, beside, just trying to get the words down, which he probably mispronounced terribly.
Which
Yeah,
he kept and still had in his possession.
Yeah.
It's one of the fascinating things that David found that I was not aware of. There's this extensive collection of materials that were collected from Oswald's personal possessions, that he kept from his teenage years on, carried from place to place. He's still carrying the Russian dictionary. It's amazing. Like he's got receipts for everything he ever did. He's a pack rat, and it's actually all, or a great deal of it is in the Dallas police archives that are online if people want to take a look at it. It was so extensive that I think at first when they started taking pictures of it, it's item by item. And then they started spreading it all out on tops of tables and just
Yeah.
taking these general shots. And it's like, you guys got tired. You're not even documenting this. You're just doing it anyway. But
that's
so
interesting.
anyway, our cut would be our assessment is that he did spend a huge amount of time over a period of time. I mean, over 5, 6 years of learning Russian to the point that he was when he came back to the US.
Yeah, obviously, I'm sure he got more proficient by living there. I mean, almost anybody who goes to a foreign country at that age and has to be completely immersed, in the language is going to improve almost by definition. So we know that's likely the case. I would
That
hope
Jay,
so.
I'd say that's like me in Spanish.
Yeah.
Took written Spanish and spoken Spanish in college. Had to drop both of them due to lack of skills. Then I got stationed in Spain in the Air Force, and okay, suddenly I'm speaking Spanish.
Yeah, I can relate. I took French and I took my wife to France many, many years ago. And I was trying to impress her with how much French I did know. And I ended up talking to a gentleman when we were asking for directions, and he looked at me quizzically and looked back at my wife, and he said to her, he said, he just asked me where the bridge to, in English, he says, he just asked me where the bridge to America was. I'm not sure I can answer that question, madam.
The
Uh,
big bridge.
one last question in this area, and maybe we'll pivot a little bit out of it, is obviously his 201 file, there's a lot of questions about when it was opened, what's in it, how relevant it is, but it was in obviously a really highly sensitive place. It was held by Angleton, and that has meaning, of course. And how do you interpret that in all of this?
David, do you want to start on that one?
Oh, no, I don't want to touch that one.
Oh, okay. That my opinion is, and I think Bill Simpich has done a great analysis of this. My opinion is that Angleton early on recognized that this was a poison pill opportunity. That having information on Oswald that he held by himself and he could trace the flow of with nobody else. We know at this point in time, Angleton's files, and this is a very important thing, Angleton's files were compartmentalized from CIA headquarters files. And so Angleton had any number of files on Oswald that never showed up anywhere. He's in a perfect position to track who has information on Oswald and who's circulating it. And I think my assessment would be that Angleton conducted or had information on Oswald that he could use for poison pill tracking all the way up to the time of the assassination. I think
Ex-
he was holding that information. And I think we've also learned, we know now that only a part of Angleton's files were ever put into the CIA headquarters files. And we know a great deal of it was intentionally either destroyed, whatever. So I do think, Jeff, I think that's a very important, and that indicates one area of unwitting use of Oswald as an entity for poison pill tracking by Angleton.
Maybe if you can explain a little bit to the listeners in this particular context what poison pill means. It's used in so many different ways.
Yeah, my definition would be if you have a full body of information on a person or an operation, whatever, and you're compartmentalizing it so it doesn't get into the system. In our case, we know, and Malcolm Blunt and has done great work on this. A great deal of the information about Lee Harvey Oswald that you would have expected to go back into the Russian division, he's in Russia. Who should know more about Lee Harvey Oswald than the Russian division? Didn't go to the Russian division. It was held back. So if suddenly you saw information that they weren't officially supposed to have being circulated, how did they get it? Was it leaked by someone? The poison pill is the information you hold that only you should have. And if you see it somewhere else, it indicates a leak. And it indicates you've been penetrated. I would say later on, we're not there yet, but the same thing applies to Mexico City. If you see information showing up, say at headquarters, that's not at a station, how did it get there? So that's the essential concept of a poison pill, is that you hold information that shouldn't be showing up anywhere else. And that's reasonably, in all honesty, why Angleton's files would be kept secret. That's the way counterintelligence works. You don't want your operations groups or even your divisional groups to have all the information if you're trying to run counterintelligence.
Makes sense. It's still quite a confounding thing to try to walk your way through it, but it does make sense when you explain it to us. Let me pivot away from that just a little bit and talk a little bit about something maybe more proximate to Oswald himself. Oswald was a letter writer. Did you get a chance to read much of his, personal writings?
Yeah.
I'm not sure how much of that is available. I know some of it was in the Warren Commission materials, but I know there's more available out there. How extensively did you get a chance to get to know him through those writings?
More than you would think. Like I said, when David came across a lot of these materials that were collected, that these are not, I don't know if they ended up at NARA or what. We know DPD had them, Dallas Police had them at one point in time. I don't know how far they went, but yeah, we have a lot of his personal correspondence. Now, obviously, a good deal of it is in Russian, stuff that you'd be interested in. The good news is Ernst Titovets, his best friend inside Russia, actually has put a lot of that correspondence into his books, and he translated it, which is really good for us.
Yeah.
So we can see the letters. Ernst would say, here is a letter that Oswald wrote to me at this given time, and he quotes it. Even more interesting is Marina was also writing Ernst at the same time, because she was a close personal friend of Ernst as well. So we can see letters from Oswald, we can see letters from Marina. In one case, Ernst talks about the fact that Marina made a little mistake and admitted to him she'd made a little mistake because she wrote a letter to a former boyfriend in Russia saying she made a mistake and married the wrong guy. And Oswald found out about it. This was not a happy thing. It's kind of like, gee, Ernst, I shouldn't have done that. So yeah, we can get, and I should say it goes beyond that. One of the things that surprised me was people, just ordinary Americans, wrote Oswald letters, and we don't think of him that way. There was correspondence between Oswald and groups like the Socialist Workers' Party. He wrote them, they wrote him back. They wrote him back and said, thanks for sending us copies of your photographic work. Thanks for volunteering to help us. So he's not isolated. He's not really the antisocial person the Warren Commission would have you believe. But there were actually, Oswald, for example, in 1963 in the summer, he did a speech, an address to a Jesuit school, and several of the students were very impressed, and they wrote him letters. Thank you for your objective view on the world. Thank you for sharing with this. And it's not like he was always treated negatively. David, you read the letters. We put one of them in. Speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I think the student that wrote him back actually was a well-written letter. He's saying, thank you, on your vision, what was happening in the Soviet Union at the time, your remarks, and how he compared, the Soviet version of communism, what it was like, and it wasn't good. That was his impression that, he said it just wasn't, the model was not what it was supposed to be, what he thought it was when he went over there. And it was, again, very well-written letter, very kind to Oswald, and I think that was the only one that came from the Jesuit, his talk there. But isn't that where he also spoke about the Minutemen?
Yeah, it's the radical right being a danger. Yeah. I
Yeah.
think there were two letters well, there was one letter, and then there was also, he got the speaking opportunity through a cousin,
Cousin, yeah.
and because their son was actually going there, and I think we got some feedback from him too. But so I guess the point is, the Warren Commission would think that he leads you to think that he was antisocial, isolated, and never even got any positive feedback, and that really isn't true. I read a letter recently, I was sharing with David. Somebody wrote about him, said, well, he's terribly frustrated. Well, he was frustrated by certain things, but it's not like he was frustrated by everything. He just wasn't, and that's a good point about the letters. Without the body of letters and looking at his writing, and this is one place, again, where I had to apologize. I had written about Oswald without looking at his own writing, his own monographs, his own political views, which he did a lot of in 1963. And very well written. It goes back to one of his Marine officers, and I think this is fascinating. His Marine officers, who's a graduate of an Eastern college, who, majored in political science and geopolitics, said that Oswald was, he would engage in conversations with him, and it was almost embarrassing because Oswald could talk geopolitics as well as he could talk geopolitics. And officers do not like this from guys who have one stripe.
Yeah, that was another one of those little bucking of authority elements about him, right? He could show he was smarter than the guys that were in charge. Yeah. But on the other hand, too, I mean, as much as there are real evidential elements that show he was capable, he was also, I think, at least in my view, a situational liar. There are very many examples. Even quite frankly, and honestly, I can understand if you're being dragged in right after the assassination of the president without counsel and you're being interrogated, that in the excitement of the moment, maybe things don't come out exactly right. But he was relatively calm throughout most of that, and really amazingly so. But there were things he said. If the recount of those, we don't have a certified transcript of anything that went on during that time frame. This is actually one of the most phenomenal lapses of judgment, or obviously done intentionally for many reasons, I suspect. But at the end of the day, what we have in what is, quote, the official record indicates that there's a lot of things he said that weren't true, and that on the 22nd, the 23rd, and the 24th. So how does that fit into your analysis of his character?
I would go even a little further than that. Oswald, and this is, Oswald did lie, not just not on that occasion. Oswald, like many of us, like, how many people alter their resumes on demand? We know that happens with CEOs even. Oswald, as an example, when he came back from the Soviet Union, was interviewed by the FBI. And the FBI quoted things to him that he had said about the United States when he was overseas in Russia, negative things. And he said, no, I didn't say that. And it's like, Lee, they had the quotes. Come on now, give me a break. It's like but he just wouldn't go on record affirming he'd done that. Now, he did say that he didn't defect, which was legally true. Oswald was a smart enough guy. He will dance around. And I got to be honest about this. He understands the system. He understands the law. He's done his homework usually. He did not defect. He never signed any paperwork renouncing his citizenship. So when he's on the radio again in New Orleans and they ask him about his defections, he goes, I was under the protection of the American embassy all the time I was in Russia, which is absolutely legally true. Absolutely. Is it misleading? Yeah, probably. When he is, I, is that an absolute right? No, that's riding the fence. That's just when he fills out resumes, he puts false references. In New Orleans, he gives a reference to a Marine he served with in the Marine Corps, Sergeant Heidel. There is no Sergeant Heidel. When he gets to apply for the job at the Texas School Depository, he lists his last employment as the Marine Corps. No, that's years before. He's just come back from, does he lie on his resume? Well, he lied. Probably the most egregious example of his lying to authority. Now, this is to authority which could get him arrested and locked up and jailed. This is in New Orleans when he goes in front of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and starts telling them a whole series of lies about Heidel and the Fair Play for Cuba committee that he belongs to, and this mysterious local organization that meets clandestinely in people's homes. And he goes on, lying to the FBI. So I would say, Jeff, it's not just, we have to be honest about this. If you want the full picture, it is not just situational. He can choose to lie when it benefits him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I wonder, if you look at his background and his growing up and his, growing up and I'm not trying to directly attribute this, but he moved a great deal. He had a single parent. She was not always there. Probably some of his early experiences contributed to the fact they probably felt like he could get away with those kinds of things, and it became a pattern of his personality. And it seems like it's a pretty common characteristic that you might expect given his background.
Well, it is, and we have examples of that too. A couple that strike me. I mean, clearly he had a very difficult childhood. As many schools he was in, as often as his mother moved, and you take this teenage boy who's in like 12, 13 years old, at a very difficult time for everybody, and you move him from New Orleans to New York City. His clothing doesn't fit everybody. His accent is obvious. Everybody's making fun of him. And he actually, he doesn't, a lot of kids would react physically and violently. I mean, I've known kids, you fight back.
Yeah.
He didn't. He just became a truant. Now, the interesting thing here is, and this is from his truant officer, it's like when his truant officer sat down with him and laid it down to him that says, look, either you go back to school and you stay in school, or you go to a juvenile home and you stay there. What did Oswald do? He went back to school. His truancy improved, virtually went away. His grades went up. He even gets like maximum grade for social responsibility in class. He starts joining clubs. It's like when you put Oswald, like it's this, we got you, he faces up to it and deals with it.
Well, he had a short stint. He had a short stint and got a taste, I think, of what it might have been like to be semi-incarcerated. So I think no doubt.
That brought it to him. So yeah, we have to be. I think one of the problems for all of us is that the Warren Commission tried to make him into something we've tried to make him into something else. You got to take him for what you've got to have this whole baseline in front of you to evaluate him. What was the constant in his character, to look for the anomalies.
Let me ask you a question along those lines. One of the fundamental points of debate is how smart was Oswald, right? And I believe you do address that in the book. The Warren Commission paints a person, a child with problems who was not much of a student. It's easy to point to his spelling and his grammar problems. You mentioned those just a minute ago. Yet we know he was dyslexic, or probably dyslexic, I suspect, right? And so certainly that might have impacted his academic progress. Well, you listen to him. His radio appearance in New Orleans clearly demonstrates that he could be pretty articulate in his speech. He was a voracious reader. We know that. And you've had a chance to look at some of his writings, and if you can discount the issues with his grammar and probably with his dyslexic tendencies, some of it's quite impressive. So, where does your analysis fall in regard to all of this? Was Oswald a smart guy? Well, I mean, how would you characterize him?
Oswald was a smart guy. I don't think there's any doubt about that. He tested at 1.118, which is high on average intelligence. Earlier, as younger in school, he had tested at 108. All of that is medium to better, medium to high level intelligence. I think one of the things that really brings that home to us, and David found these, we've looked at them. When Oswald got back to the U.S., he was pretty constantly looking for jobs. Now, by the way, he had gotten his GED in the Marines in Japan. Okay, so he did complete his high school diploma work GED in Japan, which is a lot of self-study, by the way, kind of like the Russian stuff. He did it on his own. When Oswald wanted to study something on his own, he learned it. There's just no way around that. But when he got back, he would keep going to take the testing at the employment agencies, and basically their assessments said, look, he presents himself well, he dresses well, he's clean, well kept, well spoken, and when we test him, he tests as almost college equivalent. He's the kind of person we would normally try to put in management jobs. The problem was that he always needed money, didn't have a job, so they had to find a job for him immediately. So he kept ending up with these manual jobs. Obviously, he had a problem with his resume. What's his work history? Factory in Minsk. This is not going to look great when you're trying to get a job in Dallas. Where'd you work last? Factory in the Soviet Union. No, don't put that down. So he kept ending up in these manual jobs, which were way below his capability. So we can't judge him by his jobs. And even the unemployment office has kept saying that. They felt bad because they couldn't put him in the jobs that he was really qualified for. I think the worst instance of that, and something that might have changed history, I don't know if it would have or not, when he was back in Dallas in the fall of '63, he applied for work at a photography company again, and they were going to hire him. Interviewed well, they're going to hire him, and they happened to call Jagger Stovall for a reference, and it's like, well, yeah, he worked here, he was okay, but a couple of times somebody got nervous because they said he was speaking Russian, and that blew the job for him. He was certainly brighter than the jobs he was getting. David, do you want to expand on this? I'm doing all the talking.
No, I mean, that was one of his, we said he was a photographer. That was his job. That was his goal, to actually be a photographer. And I think when he entered, according to the FBI, when he entered Mexico,
yeah. But
yeah, he said, I'm a photographer. That was his occupation at the time. So that's how he thought of himself.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that comment up, David.
Other than that, I think you covered,
Yeah. I was just going to say, I'm glad you brought that comment up because I found that strange when going through. That was in the early parts of our Oswald and Mexico series, and every once in a while you just look at something and say, that really does say something. Either it means something more than what I'm ascribing to it, or it says something about how he thought about himself. And that's a great comment to reinforce. Um, you,
And one thing that reinforces that, again, we found Oswald, from every time he could get a camera, from his teen years on through, he took 1 million photos in the Marines, 1 million photos in Russia. I'm exaggerating, but hundreds each place. And he kept them all. And when you get back to Dallas, he brought them all with him. I'm going, man, this guy knew how to pack. Um, so when the police are collecting him, one of the things David found, we're looking at him, and again, they pull out individual photos, okay? And then they start putting 6 on a page. And then they just take pictures of the photo album. Like this guy he definitely thought of himself as a photographer. And quite frankly, that's another place where the Warren Commission had to cherry pick. I won't say right up front, if the FBI, the Dallas police, and the Warren Commission had not fed the media the photographs that they did of Lee Harvey Oswald, that they created the public image of an antisocial loner. If they had put up the pictures of Lee Harvey Oswald out on the beach with girls in bikinis,
So
rather
true.
than with a gun in the backyard, give me a break. And that's why we did spend a lot of time trying to get up with what we thought was a representative set of photos for the books. Like let's show his whole life as best we can, not just what Life magazine wanted to print.
yeah, makes total sense. Let me ask you one other question about him. You mentioned Ernst Titovets a little bit earlier. You talked a little bit about him. This was obviously a Russian that he made friends with while he was in Russia, became a lifelong friend, and had, generally a very favorable view, I think, but he was seemingly objective. This is a highly educated individual. I think he was a PhD, correct? And uh, he's obviously a source that you really want to listen carefully to. You mentioned that he took a lot of Oswald's letters and translated them, so that's obviously very helpful. You had direct contact, I assume, with Ernst in all of this, and tell us a little bit about that and what you learned and
Yeah.
how it fits in.
I don't want to over exaggerate. He and I've traded emails. We've actually sent Ernst, he agreed to get a copy of the book and review and comment it. So there's a copy of the book has been on the way to Minsk and Belarus, although I have no idea how long that might take. I have not heard back from him,
Hopefully, it's
but
not the U.S. mail that's delivering it, because
yeah,
lately it's not been a great track record.
yeah. But yeah, we exchanged some emails, and certainly I was able to confirm, his attitudes towards Lee and Marina. I think it's important, and as I mentioned earlier, he was a friend of both of them.
Hmm.
He introduced Lee to lots of girls, to lots of women in Moscow, to he brought them into contact, Lee and Marina. So he was able to look at them through their, dating, through their relationship. So he gives us a completely independent view of both individuals, which is really important because we do have, if we're going to use Oswald's, I mean, how could a biographer not use someone's wife as a source? That's just not going to fly. So you have to be prepared to deal with evaluating Marina as a source as well. And Ernst was very helpful in that. He's very open about both of them. He will talk about Oswald and Marina. He was friends with both of them, but he's trying to be objective as well. I I know it's a side tangent to this point, but one of the things that I was struck for is he talked about the fact that Oswald may be the only person who ever staged a strike in a Russian factory. It's
Is
like a
that true?
one-man work
I've never heard of
stoppage.
that.
Yep.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is like a one-man work stoppage because he thought the bureaucracy in the factory was terrible. And he writes about it. Oswald wrote about that, but Ernst said he just said he was going to stop work and he was good friends with his boss. We have pictures of him with his boss, his family. And you got to imagine for a Soviet bureaucrat to have one of their workers do a work stoppage, it's like, oh, Lord,
Yeah.
this is not good. But
Uh,
that just shows that Oswald was a contrarian. There's just no doubt about that.
yeah.
But I think Ernst gives us real insights, and I won't say even I don't even think Ernst considered as good bad. It's just like this is who he was, and he was my friend, and at times he was an asshole, and at times he was great. We could even role play. The big difference about Oswald was if you liked him and he liked you, you could be great friends. Like he was with DeMoranville, with Delgado and the Marine. Uh, but most people that he pushed back against, he was difficult as an individual. So
He,
Ernst
he,
acknowledged that.
he was a bit of a contrarian, don't you think? I
Yeah.
mean, if you
Oh,
say potato, I say potato kind of a person, I think.
more than that, he reminds me if you were generally in sync with his worldview, you could be friends. But another anecdotal story, which goes all the way back to his teen years, I thought this was great, is he's in an astronomy club in New Orleans. He goes home with one of his friends, right? And you'd think they talk astronomy, and he starts talking politics. Lee does socialism, economic justice, and the father hears him. And basically, it's like, this kid's a communist. He's not going to be in my house. And he kicks him outside. Lee doesn't back down. He's arguing with the father. Lee never backs down. I knew these people in the 60s. I was there. They could be great guys in the bar, but, outside the student union, when you're about to occupy it, like maybe not. So they just, they're contrarian doesn't mean that's just, they believe what they believe.
Yeah. Yeah, no doubt. Do you think he truly loved Marina? They had a complex relationship and they were young and there was no money, and everyone, at least from my perspective, should recall the story of Brenda and Eddie, that Billy Joel song. I feel like much of what was going on there was sort of the normal young person stuff, growing up. They were young and they were still trying to find their way in life. Brenda and Eddie stuff. But it seems like one more aspect of this complex man that's really hard to understand. How do you reconcile
Yeah.
all that?
Yeah, I think it comes true again. Ernst talks about a lot of that in Russia, and we know it from the record. Oswald was a real social hit with the girls in Russia because he had an apartment of his own, and he had a good income, which was supplemented from the Red Cross, and and he was a big man in Russia. I mean, relatively speaking. And Marina, Ernst said, had been interested in dating foreigners before she when she left Moscow, came to Minsk. She was interested. She liked the glamour. She liked the glamour of the foreigners, and Oswald liked the glamour of dating a popular girl. There's just no doubt about that. And he went out of his way to kind of win her, and it was a whirlwind romance. A couple of months, and she said yes, and they got married. And again, part of the equation is he was in Russia for some time trying to come back to the US, and the State Department was pushing back against him very hard. And Russia was pushing back against Marina leaving. Very coming back to the US was hard for both of them, and it got to be very stressful. And they actually took a separation. She went to live with relatives, and they separated for a period of time because she was so stressed. And that started a pattern that lasted for years. Things would stress her, they would get separated. When they got back together again, it was great, and then it wasn't great. And when they got back to the US, clearly Marina had been intrigued with America and Americans. When they got back to the US, and there was a newspaper article written not long about the assassination, in which Marina is quoted as saying, well, Oswald was a different person back in the US. She is absolutely correct. In the Soviet Union, he was a guy that was special. In the US, he's a guy who's got a crummy apartment, never gets a car, can afford very little, and she doesn't have a plan. This is not what she expected. but all of her Russian friends that they meet in Fort Worth do. And that annoys the heck out of Lee.
Yeah, I
And
bet.
that, yeah, that starts building up. So I think what we got misled by is this pattern of behavior had almost become set through fall of 1962, through much of 1963. They are constantly separating for different reasons. He's going to look for work, or they have a falling out. Her friends are trying to separate them. Oh, come live with it. Ruth Payne wasn't the first. There were like 4 or 5 other people that she went to live with for weeks at a time before that. Some of them got fed up with Oswald being so annoying that they tried to persuade her to, ditch him. But it's like, well, wait a minute. I'm not an American citizen. What am I going to do? But then, as she said herself, he would get, he would start thinking about her, and he would show up and beg her to reunite, beg her just like, let's get back together. And she would give in. So I think your example is, how many young people does this really happen to? I suspect Lee Harvey Oswald is not unique. I suspect many young people fall in love, fall in whatever it is, and go through much the same experience, maybe so more now than did in 1960.
Yeah, crazy world that we live in. So how much stock do we put in testimony that Marina made about Lee? She's his wife, right? Ostensibly the person he shares the most intimacy with in a normal relationship. At first, she thought he did kill the president, right? And then later she said that she thought he did not. And so how do you reconcile, all of that? We know that she lied for the first several months, right? Right after the assassination, lied about knowing that Lee had gone to Mexico City, but at the same time, wasn't she at risk, legally in the early stages of that investigation?
Yeah.
And certainly then there's the Walker incident, where if she truly knew about it and then didn't go to the police about it, then, she probably was truly exposed legally, right? At that moment, when she made that decision to reveal her knowledge about the note that Lee wrote, when at the same time, again, she did not come forward contemporaneously. I mean, there was real risk there. I'm not sure they would have pursued that, but I mean, technically, she was definitely exposed. Uh, could you
For
address?
Marina, we have to understand Marina is out of Soviet Russian legal system. She's she's not even all that competent an English speaker, so how she thinks about the situation, I very much doubt that she understood American law, but certainly I think you're right, Jeff. She understood that there were things that she had not done that she might have been expected to do, withholding information, not reporting something that would have made her legally, not so much just send me back to Russia, because she was already trying to go back to Russia and had been since January
Yeah,
of
they could have put it. They could
63.
have put her in jail. I mean, they could have legally
That's
jailed
it.
her. Yeah.
They could have put her in jail. We're talking about illegal exposure. And David and I and Rex toss this back and forth repetitively. But I think one of the breaking points is when she's introduced to the Warren Commission to give testimony.
Hmm.
Her her lawyer, her representative, essentially is on record as saying, now that Marina understands that she won't be prosecuted, now that Marina understands that she's not legally actionable, she's willing to tell the truth, acknowledging that she acknowledges that she didn't tell all the truth before, uh, all the way through. I mean, no, she didn't report anything. She didn't, but now, so that seems to me to go along with what you're saying, is that certainly beforehand she had some concerns. I mean, even like information that she might have had in her hands. By the way, I knew this and I didn't tell anybody about it.
Yeah, remind me. I don't recall any circumstance where the government officially gave her immunity, but I think they probably sat her down and said, "Look, this is our position on things. We want
Yeah,
you to tell the truth, and we're encouraging you to tell the truth." And that's where it
yeah,
went. And it seemed like, from a personal standpoint, uh, Warren took a liking to her. and wanted, really felt like there was a need to protect her in the process in some way, which is kind of an odd thing. I mean, in my opinion, I mean, you're trying to understand the guy that's supposed to get over the top of this and get to the truth, and he had such a great concern for her in this without some other emotional connection to it all. I don't know. There's a lot of unexplainable things in this
And there might even have been a
passion
little
play.
guilt there. It's sort of like, I know I have to do this to Oswald, but do I have to do it to his whole family?
Yeah.
I'm not going to really go over the top, but I think Warren knew what he was doing. Warren knew that he had marching orders, and okay, you know, that might shade you a little bit, like, let's not collateral damage, let's minimize the collateral
Yeah,
damage.
I think that's a great way to look at it, Larry. I think it's a great perspective, knowing that he probably knew there wasn't really enough evidence to convict Oswald, but we're going to get him in the court of public opinion, and so why get at his family? That's really an important point, I think, for people to understand. It's you
But
know,
David, do you have anything about Marine? I mean, we've batted that back and I think we try to do that in the book. We do try to go through and call out places where Marina did not tell the truth, and she either lied or she just didn't say anything at all.
mhm.
In many cases, she didn't say anything at all, and then she did later. I think well, David, do you?
I think it could be summed up in a sentence. She was a stranger in a strange land. She'd been there about a year when all this went down. So if you think of it like that, she had no idea about the legal system, who the authority figures were. All these people were,
Plus, she was a kid. I mean, like you said, I
she
mean,
was a kid.
they were young, they were youngsters. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And
Yeah,
she has
just like,
two children. I mean,
yeah,
she has a 2-year-old and a newborn. I mean,
newborn in October, so she's
Yeah, yeah.
trying to be a mother and
Oh, and it wasn't, by the way, it wasn't just any assassin or any murder. It was the
yeah,
assassination of the most powerful leader in the world, and the president of the United States. I mean, the whole thing is almost too bizarre. I can't even imagine anybody like that not just going to a corner and crawling, putting themselves into a ball, and curling up, because I mean, these were such extraordinary kinds of circumstances to try to navigate on any level. I mean, it's a wonder that many of these folks kept the kind of composure that they did. And
and I think the people that condemn her behavior after the fact, that's not right. And the fact that she managed to go on and raise two young girls, uh, he became an American citizen. They became, she just, as you say, she deserves some respect just for surviving it. I would have been inclined to do exactly what you said. I'm not talking anything. I'm going catatonic.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. I mean, there's all sorts of rumors about her, and maybe we'll leave those for another day. But what she might have been. I mean, the whole concept of dangle, going the other way, all of that. She's an interesting study, and certainly you have to look to her to say if there was anybody that knew more about, or who should have known more about what Lee was doing or what was inside of his head, it was his wife. And the discussions about that she articulates early in uh, her testimony regarding, for instance, the crazy idea to hijack a plane and go to
to Cuba.
Cuba.
Yeah.
And if that was true, then it certainly does reconcile some of the things that we know about what he was trying to do in Mexico too. So obviously, they all fit together. Um,
and
do you?
I gotta, for those that haven't read, I think it's great. She not only says that, but she told him he was out of his mind and she would have nothing to do with it. There is no doubt that on many occasions, if you hear their dialogue, it's just kind of like that last visit on Thursday, where she says, Lee, I am not going to go with you until you get me a washing
I
machine.
know.
I mean,
Yeah.
I got a brand new baby and I got the kid in diapers. Forget, okay. Yeah, that is so real. I don't know
Yeah,
how we can ignore that all these years.
yeah,
That's as real as it gets.
yeah. There's no doubt about it. All right. So when you sum it all up about what, she's obviously the primary witness when it comes to verifying that he actually did take the shot at Edwin Walker. Do you believe that? Do you think he was the one who took the shot?
I believe that he told her that. And that's where we always have to be cautious. She is a primary witness to what Lee said. Doesn't necessarily make her a primary witness to what Lee did. I think there's ample evidence to prove that Lee was at Walker's, and given the photographs that we have, and that he was there, you know, doing something from the outside, not the inside. Okay. Um, so there's ample evidence of that. And I have no problem believing that something was going on with Lee at Walker's. Now, whether he actually took a shot, whether he was there and somebody else took a shot, whether I don't know that we can ever resolve that. I'm not comfortable that Lee Harvey Oswald intended to kill General Walker. I'm not comfortable with that. I think that was a position created by the Warren Commission to justify something else it couldn't prove. Um, so I'm comfortable with part, and I believe when she says he came home scared to death, something had just happened, and he told her it involved Walker, that you know that he did do that. I that makes perfect sense to me. What it was, I don't know. I got me on that one.
Well, it's a mystery as we have so many in this case. So let me ask maybe a sort of a parallel question. We've touched upon it on a couple of items that we've talked about. Do you think there were two Oswalds? Was the idea of having one or more imposters a fact, or was it just that these stories were not true? The fact that there were a number of known impersonations, right, that were committed prior to his coming home from the military. I mean, he wasn't even in the country when some of them occurred.
I'll
Uh,
let David answer that question, since whoever answers it has no more friends in the
Oh, yeah.
research community. But no, just kidding. Uh, the answer is
No.
I do not believe there were, no, I do not believe there were two Oswalds, in the sense that a CIA asset, deep asset, penetration asset, who could speak fluent Russian, was created and then inserted as a false detector. From everything I've studied about intelligence practices, frankly, that makes no sense to me. If you had created an Oswald of that sort, and not that practice is impossible, those people are inserted in a totally different way. You don't want them to stand out. They need to be embedded in the society. You infiltrate them at a young age and hope that you can maneuver them in positions that they're of value to you. You don't do it this way. About all I can say is, if there were two Oswalds, they sent the wrong one to Russia
Yeah.
as a false defector. David, you want to?
Yeah, I think some of the sightings were somebody that looked like Oswald, in certain places. Other may have been Oswald himself. Um, I mean, it's as simple as that. I mean, was he, somebody pretending to be him? There's that whole New Orleans sighting with the Jeeps or something like that in 61. I think Bill Sempich did some work on that and found out that didn't happen.
Well, I mean, I think it's interesting because I think there are many verified sightings where folks use the name Oswald, but my concern, I guess, in listening to it is the separate, and you're alluding to it too, David, the difference between this issue of did a different one go to uh, overseas internationally and be the false defector versus the idea that after he came back and even before he came back, they were using his name. They were using it situationally. And were they trying to set up a patsy, sort of like I call it like a piece of inventory on the shelf, a garden variety patsy. They didn't know how they were going to use him, but he was set up and could be taken off the shelf and used in a number of different ways. And maybe it turned out that they used him for the assassination ultimately, or someone did. But there are, I think, for instance, and I know you guys probably went through this, but when you track Oswald through the Mexico City uh, process. And you know how difficult it was for the FBI to document his actual mode of transportation. Of course, there's some eyewitnesses that are in that process. But for instance, how was he in Houston on Wednesday at the same time that potentially he was at Sylvia Odio's, at the same time that he was, back picking or I'm sorry, in Dallas at Sylvia Odio's, and then, in Austin, okay, at the Selective Service office with Danley, and then at the same time that night back catching the bus that he picked up at about 1:30 or 2 o'clock in the morning from the Houston area and then on to Laredo through through that route. I mean, none of that physically could have happened, or it would have been extremely difficult. And yet, there are highly credible witnesses that say people walked in and described exactly the circumstance under which Oswald, was living. And particularly I find the selective service discussion really fascinating because here was a highly credible witness. She was a relatively high level bureaucrat in that selective service office in Austin. She knew, she recalled exactly what he, said. She identified him positively in a picture. I mean, that's a scary thought to
So
think.
so is the call to the socialist, the
Yeah.
wife of the socialist in
Mhm.
Horace Twifford, I think
Houston.
his name was.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Twifford.
that's right. That's right. Yeah, that
So
night.
I think we take a definitive position on that in the book. Okay, David, be ready to die. Our definitive position is exactly that of the House Select Committee. They concluded after all their research that they were not comfortable with anything about his travel to Mexico. And I think we heartily endorse that. We're not there, but I'll take it even further back in time to your point, Jeff. I think Hoover even had a sense of that early on. When
Yeah.
Oswald is in Russia and Oswald becomes, for a short period of time, a
He
media
articulates
figure.
an imposter. Yeah.
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 It's like, is somebody going to start using his name and identity? You bet.
Yeah.
And who would possibly start using his name and identity? People that want to associate him with anti-American activities, with Cuban activities, with whatever. I think that became I think that became an opportunity for people. I think that occurred while he was in Russia, and I think it occurred when he came back. I think it. What we do see as a scenario is that what I can say for absolutely sure is part of it involved impersonation, but part of it did not. It was simply a matter of using his name. We know, for example, and I referred to this earlier, that one operational engagement with Oswald as early as August of 1963 was the fact that the DRE started a propaganda campaign around Lee Harvey Oswald. And the fact that the CIA and their case officers were very much aware that the DRE was writing congresspersons about Oswald, communicating with other anti-Castro groups about Oswald, and essentially circulating warnings about how susceptible good, right-thinking American Marines could be subverted by Cuban communism. You know, this was a propaganda operation that kicked off there, perhaps very, I won't say innocently, but this by standalone. From then on, associating Oswald, the name Oswald, with anything relating to Cuba or revolution or whatever was all to the good as far as propaganda goes. And we have no idea what the long-term goal of that might have been. Was David Phillips engaged with it? Was it going to be part of a new, larger scale anti-Castro propaganda campaign? We just don't know. Wherever that was going to go. And we do know that it wasn't just DRE. Inca was involved in that. In New Orleans, Inca was going so far as, they made recordings of Oswald on the radio, but they had a record, a propaganda record prepared to release about him, as you know, within weeks after where was all that going? Was that all in play for the assassination? Something else? We don't know. But there were people using Oswald's names. The visit not just to Odio, but to McCowan. You have somebody going to McCowan who's a known Castro arms dealer and going there to buy dozens of rifles for a revolution in Central America. How would that fit into a propaganda campaign? We can see the signs that it was building, but we don't, where would it have gone? And I have to offer the fact, I think David and I would agree, we agree whatever was going on with that was hijacked to become part of the plot to frame Oswald and associate the assassination with Castro. We really do feel that the people that were in the attack in Dallas stole an ongoing operation with Oswald to use it to frame. That's another form of poison pill if you want. Okay,
Well,
we talked about that before.
let me interject though right there, because to say that, Larry, implies, okay, that you had to have operational knowledge of that. And that also implies that it might have been an inside job of some sort. So I want you to hold on that, because I think I'd like to
Okay.
talk about that at the end. But I do think that it's hard to disassociate those two concepts when you begin to go down that path. Um, Let me ask you a little bit more on the impersonation side of this, because I'm probably more convinced today that there was a broad range of impersonations going on for many of the reasons that you've just described. So I think we're saying the same thing, but maybe a little bit different flavor of it in some ways. The Mexico City piece of this is, I think, very interesting, because and this is going to be a multi-pronged question, but and I'm sorry, I've been doing that to you all night long, to both of you, so sorry about that. But for instance, you take Oleg Nechepurenko's book that he wrote many years after the fact, obviously with all the available information out there, and he could spin the narrative probably the way he wanted. But at the end of the day, they state unequivocally in that book that the Oswald that they saw in the Dallas County Jail on the television, and the one that got shot in the garage of the Dallas Police Department, was the Oswald that was in their offices. Do you believe them?
Yes, I
You
do.
do.
Uh, and let me say, I think the honest answer to that, Jeff, if you had asked me that a year ago, I would have said I have no idea. I don't know. It literally has been what we did during the past year and kind of laying out the baseline of Oswald's character and in his activities. In 1963, if I had totally not grasped the extent to which Oswald was trying to get Marina and his back to Russia. Maybe he goes with them. Maybe he doesn't go with them. Maybe he goes as far as Cuba, stays in Cuba. I didn't have that picture. And after having spent all the time, David kept collecting the dice, kind of like, how many letters did they actually write? How badly did they pester the Russians in New York City? Constantly. Marina is still writing, and both of them are still writing letters in November, mid-November, about going back to Russia. I totally missed that. Okay. That's a big part of the story in terms of consistency. If you look at what Oswald and in November, we're writing a letter about the fact Oswald's writing saying, by the way, the FBI is harassing me and they're trying to get Marina to defect.
Yeah.
Lord, how did I miss that? Like, what did he say in Mexico City? Oh, the FBI is harassing me and they've threatened me and I'm scared. There's so much consistency that it finally persuaded me.
Well, let me just probe that a little bit more. They very specifically said in Nechepurenko's book, and in actually not only his articulation of it, but probably the other two, Kostakov and the third KGB agent that was head of the consulate there. They specifically stated that he was scared, and he stated on multiple occasions that he was afraid for his life. Yet he would not reveal to them, and this is their version of the story, what it was that he was so afraid of. although he then, would attribute his worries and the problems he had to the FBI. How do you interpret that? Because that to me is if it's true, and if you put stock in what they said, what was so dangerous, what was happening that he felt like his life was threatened?
Well, first of all, I have to be honest about attributing a little bit of sensationalism to Oswald. I mean, this is the guy who slit his wrist to convince an intourist guide to hospitalize him in Russia.
There you go.
He's not bashful. Oswald has no fear in a way. He does things that other people wouldn't do. So some of that may be drama, maybe a little bit of drama queen. When you see Oswald on the street in New Orleans going, "Okay, Carlos, hit me." Is there a little drama there? Yeah. So I will 5%, 10% drama. But what do we know in reality would and should have happened to Lee Harvey Oswald? In a sane world, Lee Harvey Oswald has just been in New Orleans. Lee Harvey Oswald is on the watch list because of communication with the FPCC. New Orleans isn't advised of this. By the way, headquarters knows it, but New Orleans doesn't. He has just lied repeatedly to a federal agency about the FPCC and this fake chapter, repeatedly under oath, and may have done so. We are open to the fact that they may have even been considering him as a potential subversive asset, a PSI informant, because of what he's told them. And he's telling them things about this group that are suspicious about the FPCC, which he supposedly belongs to, right? Oswald was legally liable for a federal crime of lying to the FBI about a national security matter. He was actionable. He should have gone to jail just for doing that. He should have been charged and arrested. Why he wasn't? The FBI's communications are poor at the best of times, or were poor at the best of times. But did he have anything to fear from the FBI? Absolutely, he did. He should have feared that he had lied to them, and they were gonna find him, and they were going to ask him to explain why he lied. Because by that time, they knew there was no Heidel. They knew Oswald was Heidel. So he'd lied. He'd showed them false identification, another federal crime. They would have been all over the fact that he had been using false ID. So did he have something legal to fear from the FBI? Were they going to catch up with him at some point in time? Certainly he had some reason to think so. In fact, I think we're still wondering why they didn't, but that's another story. But he did have something to fear from the FBI. And, a combination of that, does that all explain this scene of drama? Did Oswald have a pistol in Mexico City? Well, we know he had a pistol in Dallas. Oswald did not dislike guns. I mean, there's a man who had shot himself in the Marine Corps with a gun.
Yeah.
So you can't say, was it, I don't, all I can say is David should chime in and take part of the responsibility for this, David, as well. Yeah, like it seems consistent with the Oswald that we have come to know, and I won't say love, but at least the Oswald we've come to know. What do you say, David?
Well, it does. It kind of, he had, when he went to the Cuban consulate embassy, again, he tried to get his paperwork to get to Russia and get to Cuba first. And he had an argument with, Sylvia Duran. She was actually kind of nice, but she called in Eusebio Azque, I guess, what was it? I'm not sure what his title was at that time, but he had an argument with him.
Yeah.
Yeah, so he had quite the argument, and I guess Azque was yelling at him and said, get out of here. I want nothing to do with you. And that has to do with the whole November 9th letter that he mentions him, that he was supposed, Azque was supposed to be leaving, but going back to Havana on October 4th in 63. And the point was, where did he get that information? Where did Oswald get that information? Did he get it from Sylvia Duran? I don't know. But
Yeah, that's a great point. It's a very
Oh,
subtle, nuanced point about something that, unless he had somebody feeding him some information, how could he have said that without knowing? I mean, how did he get I mean, to that effect? I mean, Mexico City is full of stuff like that. How did he get the number of the
yeah.
military attaché? I mean, that's not published in the phone book.
Well,
I,
I can offer one answer to that question. Just speculation. Okay, I like to define speculation from knowing something, but David has researched and pointed out in her eventual testimony, since the Warren Commission didn't want to talk to her for lots of reasons that we discuss in the book, she said that his application for his tourist visa was processed and
yeah.
was returned.
Hmm.
He was issued the visa, and when she was asked whether they contacted him and informed him of that, she simply did not respond. She had told him when he was there that she would. So there's every reason to think that she might indeed have contacted him and
Absolute
informed
fact.
him. And by the way, at the time said, and Oswald would have said something, well, what about Askew? And she would have said, oh, he's gone. Um, that's a possibility. I just finished reading a document. Sometimes there are these loose ends that really emerge over time. I just read a document about his applying for a job at the as an airport baggage handler in Dallas. Actually, somebody has found the form and found that he actually was informed by the unemployment department that that job was available to him, and he didn't follow up. So there are loose ends like this that have been hanging around. But for your answer, Jeff, it Odio was real key. I'm not Odio. Duran was
Right.
real key to all of this. Duran very well, if she did what she promised him she would do, she would have contacted him and told him that his visa was approved. And as soon as they got the Russian paperwork, he was good.
So just to kind of muck this up a little bit, there was a, sorry, Larry. There was a major push on by the CIA to recruit Eusebio Azque and have him defect, whether in place or in Havana. And, Mexico City Station was quite involved, and I'll throw some names out here. So Winston Scott contacted JM Wave, and they had Tony Sforza have one of his assets, Jose Casas, who was friends with Azque, and they wanted him. He actually been to the embassy a couple times and met with Azque. They wanted him to make his final pitch before Azque was sent back to Havana. So that Casas went again. Tony Sforza said, "All right, Casas." He was one of Tony Sforza's guys in Cuba. So he went and met with Azque, and he failed. And this is September 19th. And what, a week later, Oswald's there meeting with Azque. We go into some detail on some of the things, but this was a major push, and the CIA knew about it, but not a lot of people, just a small group within the CIA knew about this push to recruit Azque. It was not well known. So, but Oswald knew that he was being sent back to Havana, but he actually didn't get sent back until I think middle of November. So they never managed to recruit him though.
How do you just as long as we're on Askway, I'm going to ask a question because he came back in 1978 and he testified in front of the HSCA and he was really adamant about the fact that the person that he saw inside the Cuban consulate did not match, physically the characteristics of Lee Harvey Oswald, and he maintained that pretty consistently, actually. And so what how do you, I mean, his descriptions were quite different than the what was in the original or not let me take a step back. His description was contrary to Duran's conclusions on this, and Duran certainly had a similar conclusion in her original interrogation. How do you feel about that? I mean, with so much evidence, particularly the Russians saying that absolutely he was there. You think it's just memory recall? It's like there's no reason for this to not match up, and yet there's all sorts of stuff that doesn't match up. So, how do you interpret all that? And is that just
I'll let
eyewitness
David
problem?
answer that, but what answered it for me, and I think you mentioned the word, I don't trust memory. I really don't trust memory on things like physical descriptions at all. Uh, you know, I worked in the banking industry for a while. And we couldn't even trust witnesses. Like you had a robbery. How tall was the guy? It could be a foot different, and then that's right after the fact. There's just
Yeah.
too much. But I think what settles it for me, and this is just a personal thing. Everybody has to make their first choice. And David found this, I didn't found it. The issue is we know that Duran had Oswald go away and get a photo. Oswald comes back with a photo. We have the photo on his application. The Cubans gave it to us. We know what he looks like. Okay. David found that in his possession, when he's back in Dallas, things that are collected from his possessions in Dallas after the assassination are multiple copies of that same photo. It's a passport photo. That's what she put on the application. That's what stayed on the application. And an identical, when you take passport photos, you get a dozen or whatever, and they're back in Dallas with Oswald. I think was Oswald that Duran was talking to.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, on that photo, and I don't want to go down the rabbit hole with you because I really want to do something separately on Mexico City if I can get you guys to do that. But that that photo, both Mirabal and Asquay said that they didn't, even though Mirabal signed off on it, they said they never looked at that. Administratively, that was something that she was, and for him to go all the way, he was a pretty meticulous guy, but maybe he was nervous or something because if he had those passport photos taken in advance in Dallas and he brought them with him, he didn't have them when he got to that's why she sent him back out, which means that he likely then had to go back to the Hotel del Comercio to pick them up. And no, I mean, it's all speculation. Nobody knows. But they asked I mean, she gave him a recommendation for a place to go and get pictures, implying that he didn't have any, right? Like he didn't say, "Hey, I've got him back in my room." So all that's a little bizarre. I mean, but again, it's the nuances of memory, I guess,
Yeah.
associated when we're as my friend Rick Russo would say, we're picking uh peppers out of that shit, I guess, something like that.
I think
Um,
we just have too much data. It's like, what's the signal and what's the noise?
yeah.
I worked in communications, and that was always the big challenge for it. We got a lot of noise and some signal. Which is the signal?
We have I know you're on some time constraints, Larry, too, and I want to make sure we get to a couple of things. One thing I'm really dying to ask you about, I just recently finished a pretty big first gulp uh, covering the radical right and its context in that period, the 1950s, late 1950s, early 1960s. And of course, your work, Larry, with Stu Wexler was a great help in getting through that series. And you so graciously gave of your time when I was researching that. So I appreciate that. And David, I know based on some of your background that you've done quite a bit of work in that area, as well too. And you and I haven't had a chance to talk about that. I'd love to pick your brain, but I'm quite interested in the work that Jeff Caulfield did. That I think actually helped to open our eyes on what really might have been happening uh, in uh, in Clinton with Oswald, and he tells the story. And in fact, I was so taken aback by that I did a couple of episodes not too long ago that I entitled Oswald and Clinton Revisited, because I really feel that the story he tells, Oswald standing in line and it's sort of that he might have been that might have been part of a quest to get at the Southern Conference Educational Fund and the rest of the leftist leaning organizations operating that sphere of activity at the time, including the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, actually, as part of all that. And quite frankly, standing as a member of, uh, SCEF or any of those related organizations would, uh, not SCEF, actually at the time. I'm trying to think of now I'm blanking on it, the organization that he
Southern
probably,
Leadership Conference, or
yeah, it was,
Core, CORE,
Core, yeah, it was Core. Yeah, standing in
Core.
line as a member of Core, which actually, in some ways, in some circles described almost as a subsidiary of SCEF and that kind of thing, would have given the prosecutors in Clinton enough to brand him. In fact, they did brand him to some extent, or an unidentified person, but it was really I think, a reference to Oswald in a public courtroom in a way that really could have, brought the whole organization down. They recently passed the subversion laws in the state of Louisiana. All of that seems quite plausible as it's laid out by Caulfield in his book. And so everybody's grappling with why in the heck would Oswald go 110 miles north to a remote location in Louisiana to try to get a job, a menial job. I mean, none of that makes any sense, I think. Hopefully, maybe you guys have made more sense out of it. But when you think about him standing in that line and being identified as a member of CORE, and right at that moment, all the House Un-American activities that in the Louisiana Un-American Activities Committee, all those things all melding together, and in an attempt to try to shut down SCEF, it really makes a lot of sense. And of course, those are the kind of things that Banister was so involved with. I think what people don't realize is the extent to which Banister was really more of a right wing guy. I mean, the whole Cuba thing was important, and it was an element of the right wing platform in the day, but it was also something that was not, sort of the core of who he was, but this was. And it just seems like that fits into the puzzle in a much, it's not like you're forcing a piece in. It fits very nicely that may in fact be what they were doing with Oswald and Clinton. Have you all had a chance to look at any of that? Do you have a sense of that?
I've looked at it over and over again. I'm sure David has. Two things, just being perfectly transparent. First, as far as Oswald's personal agenda, from what we know of what he was interested in and what he was doing, it makes no particular sense.
Right. It was inconsistent,
Okay.
right? Totally
It's
inconsistent with his
inconsistent.
personal beliefs.
Now, on the other hand, we know, and David has tracked through this, certainly the other thing that's totally inconsistent is that it happens, if the timing is right, it happens well after Oswald has already gone to great lengths to expose himself in the media as a Castro supporter, as a potential communist. So he's taken great steps to do that. He's already on record in the media. What he's doing at that point in time is media activities, if anything. And again, if I've got the timing right, it's not too long before he's actually ready to leave. But we do know that Oswald was initially, for the first few weeks that he was in New Orleans, or not the first few weeks, the first few weeks that he decided to infiltrate the Cubans or infiltrate that anti-Castro element, brought him into contact with people that had been very close to Banister. And David's gone into that far more than I have. It just so happened that these same people were close to Banister and also very close to the CIA in Miami. So is there an association with Banister? Oswald went to considerable trouble, kind of hang out with these people for a period of time. Would Banister conceivably have seen him? Was he seen around the office? Was he a known figure? Don't consider that at all impossible.
Well, there's, yeah.
So the real problem for us is not so much the association. You know, would Lee Harvey Oswald have recognized a David Ferry? Of course, he would have recognized David Ferry. So it's not the personal association; it's how you match up the agendas and the timing. That's an issue for me personally.
So you are essentially stating that you don't believe he had an active undercover relationship with Banister. He wasn't sheep dipping himself as a as a uh,
It,
a pro Castro Cuban who then was used by Banister as a dangle to get a hold of other pro
if
Castro, real pro
if he
Castro Cubans.
did, that's an interesting way to put it, Jeff. Certainly, was he representing himself that way for like 3 weeks? Yes, he was absolutely, and he was meeting all of those people that were in Bannister's circle for 3 weeks before public. Now, what did he tell them about? Oh, did he tell them he was going to start leafleting in advance? Is this whole thing with Carlos staged? It doesn't feel like that at least not from the Cubans' perspective. I don't know what Banister thought, but if Bringuier goes to the effort of reporting on Oswald to Miami, DRE, and Miami DRE says, don't trust him, test him, and he sends Quaraga to test him. And by the time Quaraga gets done, Lee Oswald is already out on the street leafleting, so that matter is resolved. Could Oswald have represented himself that could have all happened, but it would have to be during a 3 or 4 week period. It's a short time. And then would they have gone ahead and used him and said, oh, well, Lee, I don't know. I will be perfectly frank that I think I've come to understand Oswald a bit. I'm not going to say I can resolve that mystery in Mexico. David, you're smarter than I am. Come on, go ahead.
I am not smarter than you, Larry, that's for sure. So one of the keys between Oswald and Banister is Ernesto Rodriguez. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that name, Jeff.
Mm-hmm.
He kind of checks all the boxes. Oswald went to see Ernesto Rodriguez at the School of Modern Languages, the Berlitz School. He wanted to learn how to speak Spanish because he wanted to go to Cuba. So he approaches Ernesto, and this is Ernesto's words, and he said, I want to learn how to speak Spanish. I know a little bit, but I speak Russian very well. So Oswald starts speaking to Ernesto in Russian, and then Ernesto said, I had to stop because I couldn't keep up with him. He said, my Russian was not that good. So you got Ernesto, but also Oswald says, so tell me about some of the local Cubans. Who should I contact? He goes, well, my friend Carlos Bringuier. You could go see him. And you give him the other addresses, who do you see? Resto Pina, so all these names he got. So going down that rabbit hole a little bit, Ernesto, he signed the checks for the Cuban Revolutionary Consul. He's the guy that rented 544 Camp Street. He also says, yeah, I was, close with Banister. So you got guy talking, Oswald's talking to Ernesto Rodriguez, who's good friends with Banister, who rented 544 Camp Street and wrote the checks there. He was the guy. And he said he never gave his keys back. So Ernesto had the keys to 544 Camp Street. And remember, Oswald said, well, he had wrote Fair Play for Cuba Committee saying, yeah, I have an office. And he was stamping some of his literature, 544 Camp Street, that little stamp thing he had. So obviously, well, it seems to me a little speculative that Ernesto said, yeah, you could use, my office. Here's the key, to use 544 Camp Street. So there's that connection. Now, to complicate matters a little bit more, Ernesto's brother just happened to be a high-ranking CIA officer at JMA. Emilio Rodriguez, who's close to Tony Sforza, which we mentioned, who's running the operation, to recruit Asquay. Emilio, again, if you do some research on him, is so connected to everybody. Best friends with David Morales, who's admitted to being part of the assassination. Good friends with Tony Sforza. worked out of Jam Wave. His job was to recruit Cubans to defect. And he worked out of the United Nations. You would know Carlos Lechuga, all those guys. And that is his brother, Ernesto's brother. It was like high-ranking JM Wave CIA guy. He would, obviously, brother's going to talk, so they're going to know all about Oswald in Miami, besides the usual, DRE, Joe and 80s and Phil Toomey and those guys, so they all knew about him. Phillips would have known about him too. So, I mean, just that little center, that one person, Ernesto Rodriguez, is like, all right, he connects everybody you want to talk about. Just how much time we got? A little bit of time. So also looking at New Orleans, we go into in the book, these guys all knew each other. Carlos Bringuier and Ernesto Rodriguez were best friends. They would go to John Birch Society meetings together. They'd all meet together at Frank Bartez's house. Bartez was the primary delegate for the CRC in New Orleans. So you got Bringuier, Ernesto Rodriguez, Frank Bartez, Carlos Quiroga, who's testing Oswald, and you also have Sylvia Odio's uncle, Augustine Guittat, who's there. He was the assistant delegate. A lot of people don't know that. He was right under Frank Bartez. So who are they talking about? They're talking about Oswald. Let's go test him. So they sent Quiroga over to test Oswald. I mean, who knows about Sylvia Odio in Dallas? Well, all those people sitting at that table, right? So this go ahead. I should probably stop here.
Well, I would say this because I would love to continue that part of the conversation because there's some really interesting things. I mean, I think the Fontaines, right? Actually did some really interesting research on the priest and the real reasons and whether or not that's a true story or not. But how that's articulated. The fact that she didn't just meet Oswald at the moment that they knocked on the door. There was there were previous elements to this, whether that's true or not, because it flies in the face of the idea that she was one of the more credible witnesses in the witness pool for all this stuff. But it goes back to your connections that you're describing there, David. I think that I'd love to hear more.
Yeah, go ahead, Larry. We also
it also goes back to the fact that they asked her an interesting question. She said, well, did you talk to your uncle about Lee Harvey Oswald? And she said, yes. Okay. Now that's interesting. Nobody went on and said, well, did you talk to him before the assassination or after the assassination? But I think to wrap this up, Jeff, is I think what we would say, and David, is what we're doing is following what we think is Lee Harvey Oswald's agenda. Disentangling that from all of those people around him, all who had their own agendas, whether it's Carlos or Banister or, that's where it becomes really convoluted. We think we can follow him. What they thought they were doing with him, we try to piece together certain parts of it, but, that's why we use the word entangle. He entangled himself with these different sets of people that all were following their own program.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. I know we only have a few minutes left. I'd like to get some concise answers to a couple of really important questions. Do you think that rogue elements of the government were involved in the Kennedy assassination? Elements, say, of the CIA, the FBI, the defense community, the usual suspects. And I'm making a distinction here between the plot to kill and the subsequent coming together of the cover-up, because we know that's a complicated thing. And if so, will we learn more about your perspective on that in the book?
Certainly, we think that rogue elements of the CIA in particular were involved in the assassination. And those rogue elements included their surrogates, CIA, fellow travelers, officers, and a chain that enabled the assassination, but primarily within the CIA. So yeah, there were government officers that were involved operationally. And these were the same people that had been involved years earlier in efforts to kill Fidel Castro. And,
And
that includes John Roselli, and you know, that's this cadre of people. So yes, on that answer, all of those agencies were involved in covering up facts about Lee Harvey Oswald after the assassination, and essentially framing him after the knowingly. I will say this: they knew that there was more. They covered up the fact that there was a conspiracy beyond him. So after the fact, they were accessories. We know that the CIA investigated the involvement of its own officers and of Cubans in it and ditched the report. So quick answer is yes, limited involvement beforehand, broad involvement in the cover-up.
A couple of other quick things. Do you think, and you know, this is perhaps maybe is some speculation on your part, but do you think we will ever know who pulled the trigger or triggers in Dallas?
I'll let David answer. I think we can boil it down to probably a half a dozen probable suspects. You know, the standard, you know, what are the most probable suspects, but who pulled the trigger? And we know obviously more than one. So we know there were multiple shooters. We know there were multiple shooters. We know they intended it to look like a conspiracy and made no effort to cover up the fact that there were multiple shooters. They wanted it to look like a Castro-sponsored. We even discussed that in the book, how they tried to sell that. But we can't pin down by name the individuals that did the shooting. David, you want to? And I don't see how we ever will be able to.
Yeah.
David?
We only get little clues and, you know, based upon people talking, and put whatever weight into that you want. Like, was it Jerry Hemming and James Richards mentioned that Tony Esquerdo admitted to being, I don't know if you Tony Esquerdo is, he admitted to being a spotter at the Daltex meeting. He was one of Rip Robertson's best guys, highly trained, working for Commandos Mambises at the time, CIA asset, paratrooper, infiltration teams into Cuba. So he was close to Rip Robertson. A lot of people say that's Rip Robertson's picture in Dallas. And if you look at the guy walking next to him, he looks like Tony Esquerdo. You know, so
we can come up with names,
yeah,
but they're just at best they're what we can show is that these people had the qualifications, the capabilities. These are credible people that could have done it if they chose to do it. And based on their own remarks, they were happy it happened.
right. The statue in Miami of Tony Esquerdo, the only statue I know. You know, so right. You read into that which you will. And part of the World project, they buried him into Nicaragua for a number of years afterwards. He's like one of the last guys still there and guarding the arms shipments, you know, that arms they had in Nicaragua for a few years. You know, he's a highly functional asset. Why are they burying him guarding, you know,
but I don't know. Other than curiosity, I'm not even sure it's important that we do know anymore.
Yeah.
We do know, and sincerely, I think we know the nature of what happened, and we still haven't faced up to that yet, right? As a nation. So if we can't face up to that, you know.
Yeah, the rest of it's rounding for sure. I know
it was not Lee Harvey Oswald. I want to go on record with that.
Yeah, it was not.
Yeah, I think that's important to get to the audience. If there are a couple of, if I can, I'm going to keep pressing you for just a couple of more quick things. If there were just 3 things about Oswald that you could leave the audience with after reading this book, what would they be?
He was not the character that the Warren Commission or the media painted him to be. That was a setup. Okay. So if you want to learn about the Lee Harvey Oswald that really was good, bad, and indifferent, that wasn't him. You're going to have to look elsewhere. He was not all good. He was not all bad. He was a balanced individual and actually quite unique for a young man of his age at the time. It's fascinating. His story, irrespective of Dallas, would have been a fascinating story and actually would have made a very interesting story Uh, his life, as short as it was fascinating by itself, which again, the Warren Commission wouldn't want you to realize that. And finally, the truth would be the other thing, which is not our focus in the book, which the other point is that he was indeed framed, and what he thought was happening November 22nd, and this is the last third of the book, so I suppose we should mention it. What he thought was happening on the day of the assassination had nothing to do with the assassination of the president. And there is a logical scenario for all of the strange things he appears to have done that day. And that is speculative, but that is also in the book. So I guess we should mention that after 2 hours.
Yeah.
Well, and do you think that he had any, you think it was a complete 100% frame up? You think, you don't think he had any involvement at all in any of it?
100%.
Yeah.
And what made it safe as 100% is, and we have this from other sources inside the conspiracy, he was supposed to be dead. He was never supposed to be taken alive. If you keep that in mind, it all makes much more sense. The most disastrous thing for the conspiracy, the first part worked. They killed the president. The second part did not work at all because he was taken into custody.
Yes, Larry covers in his, someone would have talked about John Martino. What Martino said was Oswald was supposed to meet his contact at the Texas Theater, and he was going to get flown out of the country, and they caught him, so he was not supposed to be.
But he thought he was being flown out of the country for a totally different reason.
Yeah, he thought he was going to Cuba.
Yeah, that's it.
Out of Redbird Airport. Yeah.
Unbelievable. And that reminds me of the work that you all have done together too, which we actually referenced in the introductions, which you haven't heard, but you will. I want to ask you one last question. And I think it's getting 100,000 feet above all these incredible details. Why do you think it's important, aside from our historical fascination with the subject as a nation, and all of us individually who are involved in the research of it, why do you think it's important to continue to contribute to a better public understanding of the facts surrounding the JFK assassination?
I think as my friend and former co-author Stu Exler would say, and what he did in his API class in high school, is the study of what happened before and after the assassination is an education in the way the American system works, which covers the legal system, it covers politics, it covers media. It's a quick burst into the way the whole system works and doesn't work. It's a sanity check. If you understand it, you've got a much better insight into the reality of the American system, good, bad, and indifferent, and a lot of bad, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's unfinished business for the United States. We got to finish it one way or the other.
Yeah, David, I was going to ask you, and I'm glad that you've stated that, because it does feel like it's unfinished business. It feels like it's something really terrible that was perpetrated on the American public. It was almost like the loss of innocence. We believed, we came out of World War II believing everything the government told us, or at least most everything, and then all of a sudden we couldn't. And this was the seminal. This was the beginning of all that, it seems to me.
It's also unfinished business for Lee Harvey Oswald in the history books.
Yeah.
And his family.
Yeah, for sure. Well, gentlemen, this has been an absolute treat. To listen to the two of you articulate all of this, and David, you were so quiet, but every time you spoke, it was thunderous. I'm glad you.
Hey, this is not my first go around with Larry. Larry is like, the best as far as explaining things, and I listen. I learn every time I listen to him myself.
Well, it's very clear that the two of you have become a real powerful force in the articulation of this new book, The Oswald Puzzle. And I can't wait to recommend it to everybody who's listening to our podcast. It's a great read. I want to finish it as soon as I can, and I hope that it just flies off the shelves starting on the 14th for you. And I hope you guys will come back. I hope that you'll be interested in doing more. We love to do this from time to time. And I know you'll be busy out promoting the book probably, but when you're not doing that, please do come back and join us. And there's so much more to talk about. So many
We
more
can certainly
topics.
talk about Mexico City again. I just need to reread the book on what we said. And oh, wait, anyway,
I'm on that chapter now, Larry. So
I am not going to read all those transcripts all over again, though.
Well,
I did that already.
I listen. I listened. I sat a couple of Saturdays ago and read 200 pages of either John Witten's or
Yeah.
or Sylvia Duran's, one or the other, and it was too much. It was too much.
It's the poor Tarasovs. It's the interpreters that say, why did you people not talk to them like right after they did it rather than 25 years later? And what do you expect them to remember? It was 2 telephone calls. Oh, well. It was great, Jeff. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Jeff.
You're welcome. Enjoy, and we'll talk to you very soon. Stay safe.
Okay.
Thanks.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Thank you again for listening today to another episode of JFK, The Enduring Secret interview series. Please join us on a regular basis, and you'll find our podcast at your favorite podcast outlet, as well as our YouTube channel on YouTube. And that's JFK, The Enduring Secret.